lot of people who follow this channel follow it for one of two things. Either they're interested in what I think about a particular release, how it sounds, or they're interested in jazz history. And that kind of sums up how I think about this music as well. I'm passionate listener of music, but also I'm very interested in the history and learning as much as I can. And I oftentimes incorporate some of that learning or knowledge into my my YouTube videos. But here's the thing. All knowledge is just repeating what somebody else told you, right? Or maybe something that you've read. So what I wanted to focus on in this video is actually some of the stuff behind me. So when I first started on YouTube making videos, I did it from basically this angle, maybe a little bit tighter in on the record wall, because I thought it was important to have a record wall behind you. But people would see some of the books, and then I got a lot of comments saying like, what is that? Like, what kind of books do you have? Like, where do you learn about this type of stuff? And so that's what I'm going to cover today. So some of these I'm just going to kind of show you real quick, but I'm also going to zero in on a couple of different publications that I think are particularly interesting and maybe a good thing to augment, say, your internet research, right? So before we dive in, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. All right, so the first source that I want to talk about is Downbeat, but more specific than actually the issues of Downbeat, and that is the compiled reviews that Downbeat released. So starting in 1957 and for 8 consecutive years, what Downbeat did is they compiled all of the reviews. I think early on it was all of the reviews, and later on it might have been a selection of reviews, into a single book, and they made that available for people, for Downbeat subscribers who wanted to order it. So basically what you could get starting in 1957 is a compilation of all the 1956, right, the prior year's reviews in a single book. And the benefit of that at the time, I think, was just to understand, hey, what new music is coming out that is really good? What did I miss recently that I should keep an eye out for? You could say that that's the point today as well. I particularly think it's interesting to read some of these old reviews to see where they got it wrong. And obviously they're going to get it right in many cases as well. But it's very interesting to see, for example, what records got, like, say, a 5-star review in 1956 versus how we see them now. Or of like the new thing or the avant-garde sort of free jazz movement, especially towards the end of these volumes, the more avant-garde stuff. What was the music that was just completely cast aside that maybe we look back on it now and consider classics? All right, so for instance, this is what the very first edition looked like, right? So it says Downbeat Jazz Record Reviews. Came in paperback. Mine happens to be a hardcover. I'm not fully convinced that this was actually released by Downbeat, although Downbeat did have the ability to both get hardcover versions of many of these 8 volumes of books, as well as have potentially your name engraved on it for an additional fee. In any event, it's possible that this was compiled later, or not compiled, but bound later by a collector. I bought this and a number of these others by the same person, and they were all hardcover, but I'm not aware of actually the first volume ever being bound in hardcover. So, for instance, within this, you'd be able to take a look at the review, the original review for Dexter Gordon's Dutone release, right? So that famous like Dutone label release that was put out, and you can see that it was a 3-star rating, and and it's always interesting, right? Especially in retrospect, these albums that we consider just these grails or whatever, right, that are worth thousands of dollars, and then you go back and see at the time, what did they really think about it? Did they even enjoy it? And in this review, it says his conception could be more imaginative. Gordon swings hard and has a virile tone, but in his case, it's a matter of his conception being competent, but hardly distinctive or newly illuminating. So just kind of an interesting, perspective. Meanwhile, there are other artists that Downbeat tended to appreciate more, say, than others. So Dizzy Gillespie is a good example that they would give mostly 4-star, 4.5-star, 5-star reviews. Stan Getz is another. I mean, it's easy to see why he was so popular at the time, because you go back and look at these reviews, and what is it? Stan Getz at the Shrine got a 5-star. Here's another Norgren interpretations by the Stan Stan Getz Quintet number 3, 4.5 stars. Here's another 5-star, volume 2 on Norgren. So it's interesting because at the time, people really didn't have the ability to assess what was going to be a good album or a bad album unless they had the ability to actually see some of these folks in concert. And so they would go to Downbeat as the authority. And when Downbeat gives a certain artist all 4- and 5-star reviews, well, it's going to lead to the inevitable, right? That their stuff is going to sell and that they're going to be a little bit more popular. Am I insinuating that they were biased? I think I definitely am. I think that there were certain artists that that Downbeat just didn't like as much. Another example, though, of an artist that Downbeat really liked was Miles Davis, especially early on. So in this particular volume, you can read about his early prestige titles. So catalog number 7044, which got a 4.5 star, 7007, which got a 5 star. 7014, which got a 4 star. So again, certain artists, don't get me wrong, oftentimes it was because the music was indeed fantastic, but also there is definitely a little bit of bias on the part of the reviewers that is just evident in these books. So 1956 is right there. This one is 1957. Again, this is a hardcover edition, but these did come in soft cover, and they were bound actually with that soft cover as well. So this would have been 1957, volume 2. You've got 1958, volume 3, 1959, looks like this, changed it up a little bit, volume 4. This would be 1960, volume 5, so they went to much thicker. So actually here, if you look at the thickness of say, the previous year, 1959 versus 1960, you can see a significant difference in terms of content. These must have been popular because they started adding some pictures in here and just a little bit of additional content. They actually started to expand the reviews as well. So as jazz was becoming more popular, as more people were interested in reading these reviews, they ended up writing more of them because there were more releases. And so, again, if you wanted to read about Cannonball Adderley Quintet in San Francisco, Riverside, 2.5 stars, and you can read, several pages about it. You can read about King Curtis, the new scene of King Curtis, which came out on, I think, on New Jazz. You can read about that 3-star review. And I'm just kind of looking randomly. Booker Little, his release on Time. A lot of people love that album. They gave it 2 stars. And again, this is a lot of text. It's not just, hey, what's the title? Here's the stars. It's much more than that. You can learn about what their perspectives were. So they kept that larger format for the next volume, which is volume 6. For volume 7, just changing up the color, and volume 8. And if you're somebody who likes to sort of look at things on your shelves and see how beautiful they are, obviously these are they can be quite striking when on the shelf. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about, really, is these Downbeat compilations. Now, if you're interested in grabbing some of these, you kind of have to set up your eBay searches, or you have to be just a little bit of a an investigator at your local bookstore, used bookstore, because many of these volumes have started getting up in price with more people coming to the medium, as everything else, as with albums and everything. So these can be hard to get online, especially for a cheap price. I would say to expect to pay somewhere between $75 and $100 for a lot of these books, although every now and then, again, people aren't necessarily looking for books. A lot of us who buy on eBay don't have books is even part of our search criteria, right? Maybe we're only looking at vinyl. So you can still come across these, and you can still buy them when someone doesn't really know what they have, and that's kind of what I've done as well. So anyway, the first topic is keep an eye out for these Downbeat volumes. So a lot of you may say, if I can't get the Downbeat compilations of reviews, why don't I just go for the original item, the actual Downbeat issues, right? So I do have some of these. So here's a October 29th, 1959. We've got Oscar Peterson right there on the cover. Some of these had pictures. You can see here Gene Krupa. This is March 20th, 1958. Who do we have here? This looks like Shelley Mann, right? October 17th, 1957. So, these are certainly a way to go at getting the same content, but the problem is on eBay these days, each of these Downbeat editions, and they're not big, right? Especially early on, they're usually about 40 pages or so. So it's pretty minimal, I would say, and actually compiling everything that you would need for even a given year. I mean, these things came out, what, like every week? I don't think this is bi-weekly. I think this is a weekly publication, at least at this time. So that's a lot of editions of Downbeat that you would have to basically put together in order to get at an entire year. And here's the thing, it's not to say that you need to buy all of them. In fact, I certainly wouldn't advocate, I don't know, anybody can collect whatever they want. I'm sure that there's collectors of Downbeat editions, but or issues. Most of the time people buy this stuff based on the cover. Sometimes they buy it based on the content. So for example, the first issue that reported on Coltrane's death is interesting, right? Just to get that kind of reaction. But in any given issue, you're going to have lots of different articles, right? So this one has Shelly Manne on the cover, but there's an Art Blakey feature, there's a Jimmy Geoffrey feature, Mary Lou Williams, and more, right? So there's a lot in these, and I do have some. Now, an alternative that is not, I don't know how viable this alternative is, but something that I have and something that is represented well on the back wall here are annual compilations of Downbeat issues. So this one happens to be 1969, every Downbeat edition. And I bought this from a collector who had them bound himself. I don't think that you can just buy these anywhere. I will say though that this collector was not the only one to have done this. There was a lot of people who were Downbeat subscribers, and at that time they would have every edition, and they would have them professionally bound, because I think it was just a thing back then. I think people were amassing libraries much more so than they are today, and having some of this content to refer back to. So in such a compilation, you still have that cover. So we have Sonny Rollins here. And yeah, I mean, this is just it's obviously a handy way for me to be able to reference not only the reviews, but also all of the content. And you may ask, why do I need those other books that compile the reviews? Well, that was only 8 years. There's only 8 volumes of those books, and that was it. They didn't do it anymore. So certainly by 1969, they were not doing it. And so none of this is represented in those volumes of books. Those books just kind of, those compilation books just sort of cover, I guess what I'll call the like golden age or something like that of at least hard bop, right? Whereas you get a lot more about social context and a lot more sort of other articles, right, in a compilation like this, or in the individual reviews. And so I personally find these to be a great resource. I do love the pictures. I do love these original covers. I mean, at the very least, if you're somebody who's a fan particularly of, say, Sun Ra, or John Coltrane or Miles Davis or Anthony Braxton or whoever that is, you can probably just go and seek out some of these Downbeat editions based purely on the cover, and then you can mount them or frame them and put them on a wall and have something to look at. But I like these because I just love reading the history, and I'm not even kidding when I say I read these front to back. I read every single thing in this, outside of like some of the like the classifieds or whatever, because there are some classifieds, but I read every article. I have not completed reading all of these, but I keep at least one of these volumes by my bedside, and I'm constantly reading just because it's something that interests me. All right, so another good resource is Jazz Journal, another publication that was put out on a regular basis. This one happened to be put out in the UK. And it's kind of like it's the UK equivalent to Downbeat, is basically what it is. Now, I will say that the UK audience was interested in a very different type of music than the US audience, at least at any given point in time. And so what you'll find, say if you're looking at 1960 or so in the US, is going to be very focused on like Brubeck and Miles and Coltrane, whereas if you're looking at 1960 in the UK, you're going to be looking at a little bit more of like the throwback stuff, Dixieland, ragtime, or even just like, I don't know, 1940s stuff, I'd say. So similar to Downbeat, I do have these sort of bound editions. This one happens to be 1968 to 1969, but you can go find the original editions as well. And I do love reading this for, again, that kind of European, or at least the UK perspective. One of the things to note about Jazz Journal is that they had much better covers. Look at how fantastic this image is of, got to be Coleman Hawkins there, right? Or here's another. So usually they did like a monotone, or single color and then black and white. Here's another one with Roland Kirk. Just really, really inspired, in my opinion, covers. And you're going to get a feature on each of those musicians inside, but there's a lot of content here. They're covering, certainly by 1968 and 69, they're covering probably the same stuff that was going on as in the US. But like I said earlier on, they seem to really hold on to the sort of the older giants of jazz. But super interesting to get that perspective, and you can find Jazz Journal editions or issues, individual issues on eBay as well. So then if we're kind of doing a little bit of a tour of at least English-speaking audiences, you also have Coda. So Coda was a publication that was put out in Canada, and they also went for the sort of monochrome cover. So here you've got one, what year is this? 1976. Some of my Coda compilations are a little bit later, but you can see fantastic covers. This one is of Art Farmer, probably higher quality here too in terms of like the stock of the paper and everything. And you can usually find these in good shape because people that held on to these, they didn't really, I think they probably sat on the shelf. I personally love going back through these and again, finding out what was going on with individual musicians at any given point in time. This one looks like it's going to be highlighting Oliver Lake and Miles Davis. But it's very interesting because even as late as say 1976, you're getting interviews from, again, Miles, you're hearing about like where he was going on tour, who he was playing with. You're getting updates on, say people who died recently, like famous jazz musicians getting a little bit of an obituary. I find that because a lot of the content that's in, say, Jazz Journal or Downbeat or Coda or some of these others, it hasn't necessarily always been digitized. So I don't think you can go online anywhere and say, get all the Downbeat reviews or even get a specific Downbeat review. They haven't been digitized. And so kind of the only way that you can get at a lot of this content is by sourcing these original publications. And so I'm not advocating for people who are already, neck deep in vinyl to then all of a sudden get neck deep in this type of stuff. But what I would say is that you can look out for lots, right, on eBay where there might be like 10 or 20 or 30 different editions of Downbeat, and usually they don't go for that much. And it's it's a good way to sort of just sort of add to your knowledge, kind of explore through some of this stuff what was going on. A couple of other less interesting but still noteworthy things that you can keep an eye out for. So another publication that I think was maybe more popular in, say, the 40s and early 50s is Metronome. So again, similar to some of these others, I do have these bound. I did not bind any of these myself. I found basically what happened was there was somebody listing this stuff on eBay, and I bought a couple, and then I reached out to them and I was like, how many of these things do you have? And they explained to me the person who was getting rid of all these books, and I basically just went in and bought as many as I could. So that's how I came upon these. But again, I've seen some of these publications bound before, and it is something to keep an eye out for because it seemed like collectors did it. So Metronome kind of looks like this, probably the least inspired in terms of covers. You are going to get, certainly with my volumes, because this is like 1949, you're going to get a lot older content, but still it's interesting. A lot of this stuff covers big band, but you're also talking about some of those bebop artists, especially early on. So it's interesting to see how they weave in, say, Charlie Parker in the same conversation that they're talking about Artie Shaw, right? So I still get a lot of value out of processing the information in these Metronome books. Another publication that was pretty popular at the time is Esquire. So we all know Esquire magazine. They were making a play similar to like Playboy, right? Trying to get involved in the jazz scene. So what they would put out, this is actually not something that was later bound. This is bound by Esquire. So you could read about jazz in Esquire's publication, but what they did is every year they put out a jazz book. And the jazz book was something that kind of summarized, I guess, what had happened over the course of the year. These are pretty interesting in terms of the artwork. So I don't know. I mean, it's obviously like an older style of illustration, but it's still quite interesting. So this is the Esquire's 1947 jazz book. Or they call it Yearbook of the Jazz Scene, and so they'll do different profiles. You've got Ella Fitzgerald here. They'll do some different articles, and again, kind of a sum up of the year. So I only have a couple of these. I've got 47, 46, and 45. I don't know how many years they made them. But these are kind of interesting, and this is the sort of thing that you'll find just in a bookshelf at an antique shop, or maybe a flea market, certainly an estate sale, right? That's something that goes under the radar because people who are interested in jazz aren't necessarily interested in books. If you're like me, whenever I go to a used bookstore, I'm always going to the music section to see if they have anything like this, just because I love it. All right, so the next up is probably something that is a little bit obsolete these days, especially because of the fantastic website jazzdisco.org. I'll put a link here. You should check out Jazz Disco. What they do is they catalog basically every session of every album, including sessions that didn't make an album, or where like there was a session and 3 tracks was put on an album and there was 3 others that were cut. They have all of that information. You get dates, you get artists, label, everything like that. So if what you want to do is understand, essentially all the sessions that might have made up a particular album, or maybe again some of those unissued sessions, unissued music, you can go and research it there. But before Jazz Disco existed, a lot of that information was compiled in books like this. So this is Prestige. It's called the Prestige Jazz Records 1949 to 1971. And what it does in basically typewriter type is it does the very same thing. It's like a catalog of all the sessions. It talks about the song names, who was playing on it, what the date was, where the session was, whether the track was rejected, whether it made the album, whether it not only made an album but also made a 45 single. Here's the problem. You can't use Control F in this book, right? This is like old school stuff. Like you gotta go in and there might not even be a like appendix or anything at the end. You got to go in and just basically look through the thing, and it's going to be in order probably by time period. I'll have to go back in and see. But in any event, they made this for Prestige. They made them for a bunch of labels though. So this is another one that's for the Savoy label. They just call it Savoy, a discography. And they have here, you can take a look and see kind of who the who's referenced on this one. Let's see, this is an old library copy, but yeah, it does the same thing. Yeah, I mean, just the date and who was playing and what the album was for all of the Savoy releases. And then yes, of course, everybody would be interested in the Blue Note one. This one happened to be compiled by Michael Kuskuna, who's obviously very involved or was very involved with the label. And it is the same kind of thing. So you can go through this entire thing. Again, all this content is on Jazz Disco, or I'm sure like almost all of it, or possibly more content is on Jazz Disco at this point, because this is a little bit of a snapshot in time. But it is interesting that they were able to compile this type of detail at that time. I can't imagine the sort of the effort that went into this. So yeah, another one to keep an eye out for. This is put out by, let's see, Greenwood Press. And again, it's just called the Blue Note label discography. So if what you're interested is new music, there's almost this sense that if you're accessing actually a physical publication, that what you're seeing is already out of date, right? Because the internet is talking to you at the same time about everything that's coming out. Not everybody has the, bandwidth, right, to follow all of these different sources, because most of them are biased. They're only talking about, say, their releases or just, something, that's like, they're just promoting, like, say, an individual label. One publication that I find super interesting that is put out by a label but actually is more broad in scale is We Jazz. So We Jazz Helsinki, or sometimes just called We Jazz, they put out this magazine, and it comes out quarterly. And it's fantastic. So this one, it's not just called Revelation. That just happens to be the title of that particular edition. You have Shadow Shapes. You've got Universal Beings. And these are dense. It is small type, but there's lots of photos. You get discussion about specific releases that are coming out. They will oftentimes focus on their own releases, but they also focus on a lot of other labels. And the labels that they talk about are not the ones you'd think. So they're not talking about, say, Blue Note and Craft Recordings and things like that. They're talking about new music, and typically by smaller labels. Heavy presence in obviously the European stuff, but not necessarily exclusively. And yeah, I actually get a lot of enjoyment out of these things. These are not, with shipping, these are not the cheapest in the world. They might be like $20 or something like that. But a pro tip is you can go to Dusty Groove, which I believe is out of Chicago. Yeah, they're out of Chicago. Dusty Groove will actually sell these in the US, and then you don't have to worry about not only the purchase price, but then paying for international shipping. You just have to know that Dusty Groove gets theirs at the same time that anybody else would if they're ordering directly from WeJazz. So sometimes, you know, you're gonna have to wait just a little bit longer in order to go to their website and buy some of these editions. But I'm a huge fan of this. It helps me stay on top of new music, and I have definitely ordered stuff based on learning about it here. All right, so just a couple more, and we're not getting into biographies. You can, you know, obviously look for biographies, or maybe at some point I'll do like, hey, these are my top 10 favorite biographies on jazz musicians. I do have a bunch. But I'm thinking a little bit more like sort of all encompassing in terms of like history that's not specific to one musician. So I just want to show you a couple of other things. So one is, this was put out somewhat recently, and it is it's a book on the art of Sun Ra. So this is super interesting stuff if you're interested in Sun Ra. The funny thing is that I'm not that interested in Sun Ra in terms of his music, but I am a little bit fascinated about all of the custom sort of artwork that they did throughout all these albums. And this one kind of compiles some of the most interesting stuff, and I think they did a good job. Some of this stuff they actually sourced from collectors on on Instagram and stuff, because you know, there's not like one person, well there probably is, but there's few people who have just a ton of original Sun Ra in order to form an entire book. So they kind of crowdsourced that one. On the topic of collectors, there's a few books that are out that profile specific collectors. No one has asked me if I want to be a part of it yet. And you know, here's the thing: they pick they pick great collectors for some of these books. But you know, I'm just saying, if anybody's compiling future versions of this book and want to talk to me, that'd be great. So this one is really hefty. It's called World Records: Conversations with Record Collectors, Volume 1. This is put out by Ian Wakefield, who I believe is out of Europe. And some of the collectors profiled in here I am quite familiar with, and even I talk to sometimes because they're on Instagram. Like, yeah, Pam's Records is here. Like, there's a bunch of super interesting folks with amazing collections. You get like photos and stuff. This is not about jazz history. This is a little bit more like books about books about collecting. Oh, here's a good one. This is a guy that everybody should follow, Midnight Ryan. So if you know Midnight Ryan on Instagram, he's featured in this thing. His collection in his room is fantastic. So that's pretty cool. And then probably the obvious one. This one came out maybe even a little bit earlier. Is Dust and Grooves. I think they're well on to their second volume of this thing. This thing also profiles record collectors. I think Questlove is in here. Love to have my collection appear next to Questlove's in a book. So anyway, these are some about record collecting. And then, you know, a lot of labels also kind of have their own publications. There's one that's called like The Story of Impulse that I have somewhere in here. I didn't happen to pull it out. But you also have the History of Verve. This is an interesting book because at the same time that I think it was originally expensive, I believe that you can get this on like, not the second-hand market, but almost like discount or like wholesalers, like half-price books and stuff like that sometimes stocks this. So you can get it for relatively cheap, and it goes through a lot of prominent recordings, talks to you about the history, you know, much more detail than you'd get from, say, the liner notes of any of these things. So I really like this Verve book. And then one of the sort of, you know, crowning achievements in terms of a label retrospective is certainly Uncompromising Expression. right? So this is Blue Note. It is a fantastic book. Came out some years ago. It goes through, you know, a ton of the not only the classic albums, but it'll show you like contact sheets. It'll show you like how some of the original album covers came together by looking at all of the different photos that they could have chosen, which I think is one of the most interesting things about the book. But they also will do kind of a profile on each of the albums if you want to learn something a little bit more. So just another like endlessly fascinating and really beautifully done book. All right, so that's it. This might not have been interesting to some, but hopefully interesting to others, because as I said, as I led with, I know there's a lot of people who are interested in some of the stuff that's behind me. So hopefully you have an idea, I guess, of some of the resources that, and you know, how some of these little bits of knowledge have somehow made their way inside my head and that I talk about in some of these videos. So yeah, have at it. Go out and search for these and probably the many other publications where you can learn about this fantastic music. Thanks again, as always. Appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time.